welcome back to the channel. I am your host Muriel, and guess what? I went to see it at the movie theater around 3 weeks ago now, and with my lovely partner as it so happens. That's right, The Backrooms, which I thoroughly enjoyed, and what's more, enjoyed comparing and contrasting to other works of fiction and flavors of SFF, shall we say? So that's what I'm going to talk about today. First off, why did I, someone who admittedly only rarely watches movies these days and goes to the actual movie theater even less than that, decide to make the effort for this one? Well, there are a few reasons. Last year, I read Mark Z. Danielewski's House of Leaves and freaking loved it. It in fact became a new favorite of mine. And, well, the Backrooms phenomenon and liminal space horror more broadly both pull from the same kind of stuff House of Leaves is inarguably made of. Or more than that, actually, since House of Leaves stands as the OG in this case, since it significantly predates the infamous 4chan post that launched 1,000 liminal space images, creepypastas, and found footage videos on YouTube. More generally, I'm a big fan of weird fiction as a specific subgenre of fantasy and science fiction storytelling. China Mieville and Jeff Vandermeer are two of my all-time favorite writers. The Southern Reach is my favorite science fiction series of all time. I'm a big fan of good old H.P. Lovecraft stuff, not the man himself though, for obvious reasons, and, well, liminal space imagery, the Backrooms as a concept, and then technically SCP Foundation stuff too, and the uncanniness of it all falls squarely within that territory, if more straightforwardly and pointedly on the horror side of things. Although, liminal spaces and states don't always have to be horrifying. They can be more neutrally or even positively weird or supernatural, and I just kind of naturally vibe with that stuff across the board. I mean, there's a reason I love, for instance, the Twily in The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, that I fuck with anything to do with Celtic otherworlds in folklore and mythology in general, really. Hell, then my favorite time of day is Twilight. Well, okay, I'm probably 50-50 when it comes to being an evening lark or a night owl, but then that still makes it a liminal in-between state, so my point still stands, and you get the gist. Be that as it may, we are more chiefly concerned with the spooky side of liminal spaces here. So I must add that another thing that attracts me to the weird horror fiction that features them is the fact it also falls into, or can at the very least, often overlap heavily with the subgenre of cosmic horror specifically, which I'm obviously a big fan of given the authors and works I just mentioned, and which, wouldn't you know, features to varying degrees in a lot of weird science fiction and fantasy. It's all connected. Now, fair warning, I'm not going to shy away from spoiling the actual movie in this video. I am, however, going to try and keep spoilers for House of Leaves and whatever else I talk about in relation to the Backrooms to a minimum, though I can't promise I won't mention a couple of plot or world-building details here and there, because, you know, I want to be able to nerd out over this shit. Just full on. I don't think said details should prevent anyone who hasn't read House of Leaves, or whatever else I happen to mention, from enjoying it, but you all know yourselves better than I do, obviously, so proceed with caution. So yes, I am going to assume most of you currently watching have seen The Backrooms, but out of principle and habit, I suppose, here's a basic gist of the movie's premise. The story, set in 1990, this will be relevant later, follows two main characters. Clark, a recently divorced man who owns a, well, yes, failing warehouse furniture store, a store he also lives in because of his divorce, and Marie, Clark's psychiatrist. After the movie's found footage opening showing a man in a yellow hazmat suit deep in the Backrooms trying to touch base with his seemingly lost fellow explorers, we cut to Marie witnessing the demolition of her childhood home. A home she shared with a very mentally ill mother, think paranoid schizophrenia and pathological hoarding type stuff, and quickly come to learn she carries a fair bit of trauma tied to that, and that she's, well, a bit stuck in life. The same basically goes for Clark. He feels very stuck in his life, very resentful towards his ex-wife and the fact he never got to work as an architect, and consults Marie to manage anger issues that presumably result from all of that. So Clark lives in his furniture store, like I said, and starts to notice a flickering problem with the lights. At night, when they should be firmly switched off, he calls in an electrician who says everything should be working fine, so let's go and look at the fuse board down in the basement. Lo and behold, it features a few odd switches haphazardly stuck to the board that don't seem to connect to anything. Weird! But it's left at that. The following night, the lights start flickering yet again, and when Clark goes down to investigate, he notices a thin crack of light coming from its back wall. Approaches to take a closer look, and then, you guessed it, stumbles into the back rooms. And the rest is cinema. Or, I mean, in this case, the movie's plot. Before I properly get into the meat of it and dive into what I especially loved about this movie, I'd like to express my appreciation for its more surface-level elements, its aesthetics, if you will. Because this movie looked great and had a lot of atmosphere. I really enjoyed the level of care and detail that clearly went into bringing the Backrooms to physical life. The sets, I mean, I'm assuming this movie mostly had sets, seemed to be like there wasn't all that much CGI here, though feel free to correct me if I'm wrong. Movie production isn't exactly my forte, but so the sets were gorgeous and gorgeously weird. And the unsettling weirdness of physical space in a liminal space really came through strongly from having actual people, real actors, interact with it. That was great. And then, so I forgot to mention, I've never actually seen any of Kane Parsons' YouTube videos, but I watched a playthrough of Escape from the Backrooms, for whatever that's worth, and I've watched content about the Backrooms and online liminal space imagery, so I'm reasonably familiar with the visual hallmarks and tropes of sorts of both phenomena, and was thus able to appreciate most of the nods given to them, a lot of which I'm aware were also simply transferred over from Parsons' original content. The, shall we say, more greedy side of me would have liked an even greater variety in the movie's featured Backrooms environments, but I can largely put that aside because there's a specific thematic reason we got the ones we got, but I'll obviously come back to that. The movie's score was quite effective as well. Like, it fit the tone very, very well, so point for that. And besides the fact I thought the acting was quite good, not that I paid that much attention to it as such, because this movie is firmly ideas and vibes driven, rather than character or plot driven, or the fact the character was what it needed to be, I really appreciate the fact people in this movie freaked out, behaved in a way that genuinely displayed a sense of fear and just, what the fuck is happening? Also, at times, mixed with fascination and a desire to keep exploring, mind you, but at least I saw fear. Minds not breaking, perhaps, but at least noping the fuck out for a few minutes. Because I've just read, watched, played maybe, way too much SFF that features characters not reacting like they clearly should to brain-breaking shit. And I don't know about anyone else, but I find that incredibly annoying. So point for a modicum of cognitive emotional realism there. Thank you. So now I can move on to the three big things I really dug about the Backrooms movie. The first is that it pays heed to, nay, combines all the facets of what I'm going to umbrella term the liminal space horror phenomenon. Because yes, I think there are a couple of distinct facets to this. In Super Eyepatch Wolf's truly excellent video essay titled Horror in Impossible Places, Liminal Spaces, and the Backrooms, which I can't recommend enthusiastically enough, he lays out a thesis I entirely, or almost entirely agree with, that there is a distinction to be made between the Backrooms as an online phenomenon made up of photos and videos and liminal space horror. Both seem to have popped off around the same time in 2019, 2020, emerging from the same 4chan image post, but they focus on slightly different things. Backrooms content takes place in liminal spaces, yes, but it also features weird, creepy entities, monsters, that chase people who no-clip or glitch into what is essentially their territory. The horror focus, if you will, thus lies on the monster factor, whereas liminal space horror primarily derives its spookage from the weird, uncanny, fucked up physicality of the space itself, or state if you want to expand into other forms of liminality, and its inherent, potentially understanding of reality threatening mystery. Besides that, there's also the broader liminal space imagery sharing phenomenon, which, like I said, doesn't solely revolve around scary images. Let's be clear though, liminal space horror as a concept undoubtedly predates its online incarnation and its backroom sub-branch, shall we say. House of Leaves, as an example and a reminder, came out in 2000. So the Backrooms movie obviously features the Backrooms aspect of the phenomenon. Duh. And gloriously so. It also features what I would identify as a third facet of the phenomenon, or a sub-facet of the Backrooms one, I guess? Well, I mean, I guess you can kind of find the basic idea of this in other works of fiction too, like The Southern Reach, actually, or something like the video game Control, which I played and streamed earlier this year. So it's what I'm going to call the SCP Foundation aspect, or more broadly, the spooky government ops facet. We have a government body, or private body, it doesn't have to be government, I'm just more used to that formula, covertly sending explorers into the liminal space to study it and its critters if applicable. Now, again, not being that familiar with the specific lore present in Kane Parsons' videos, I only learned after watching the movie that Async, the company studying the Backrooms, comes from his original content. So fair enough. But I don't think that element is present in every Backrooms video ever made. I'm also evaluating this movie on its own merits, especially since writers other than Parsons were involved in it, so to me this still kind of counts as its own distinct facet that I'm glad the creators decided to include, if to a much lesser extent than the obvious and unavoidable Backrooms with a monster one, or the proper liminal space horror one. Because yes, to my mind, the Backrooms movie does a great job of blending the kind of horror exemplified by Backrooms content, with spooky entities, a big monster and attendant monster chase sequence, with actual liminal space horror, because there is a genuine sense of dread and, well, yes, cosmic horror tied to the existence and exploration of the space itself, its properties, and the potential, yet ultimately non-fully graspable meaning within it. And it's not like this facet was ever fundamentally incompatible or mutually exclusive with the monster stuff to begin with, right? In fact, that's where I somewhat disagree with Super Eye Patchwolf's thesis. Or maybe it's not so much a disagreement as a case of he didn't articulate that specific point in his video, and fair enough. Yes, shoving a monster into a liminal space definitely shifts the horror focus onto said monster, but I don't think it automatically cancels out the horror of the space itself either. So with that in mind, I think you can absolutely have both facets work in a story. And I mean, this movie amply proves my point. That being said, I definitely hold a preference for the liminal space horror facet, sans monsters, or sans obvious monsters at the very least, for the cosmic horror potential it holds, for what House of Leaves does with its story and world building. And so yes, House of Leaves my beloved, because the second big thing I loved about the Backrooms movie is that it gave me the kinds of chills and sense of cosmic dread I experienced reading Mark Z. Danielewski's chunky, a gothic horror novel. No. Or at least, reading parts of it, chiefly the Navidson record and all the shit that goes down at the liminally fucked house on Ash Tree Lane. It's important to stress that because, again, House of Leaves is a chunky, ergodic, and meta-diegetic novel, and as a whole, the only book I've read that I'd agree is basically unadaptable. Forget Dune or Annihilation, there are working movies of both, though, the latter can go fuck itself with a white-hot poker, and I will never change my mind about that, and The Southern Reach deserves something infinitely better, preferably animated, video game, but I digress. Forget H.P. Lovecraft, even, because sure, a lot of his eldritch monster stuff boils down to it was indescribably horrific, and then the dude's mind explodes, but you can still get creative and have fun with it, fundamentally. House of Leaves is a different beast altogether, especially given the role its ergodic formatting actually plays in delivering its sense of creeping dread. You really can't translate that to film, in my opinion. The best you could do is go the video game route, I think, if only because you can get away with having a lot of actual written text in games. Well, depends on the kind of game, obviously, but you get the idea. The story of the Navidson record, specifically, however, could absolutely be adapted to the screen. And I'd be interested to know if there are House of Leaves readers and enjoyers among the Backrooms creators, because there are definitely elements in the Backrooms movie that echo elements present in House of Leaves and its Navidson record. My favorite part of the movie was unquestionably the found footage sequence in its first half. I also really enjoyed its opening found footage sequence, in no small part because it gave me huge 5.5-minute hallway vibes. Oh, the chills. Oh, the uncanness. Oh, the fucked upness and beckoning mystery of that liminal space. Once again, no. And even nom with regards to its monster chase, because you don't actually see the monster at that point. There's plausible deniability there, in a way that also reminded me of House of Leaves. And as to even more specific elements, the movie shows us there are stable doorways into the Backrooms, which, as far as I understand it, isn't usually a feature of online Backrooms content. In those videos and stories, people generally glitch, no-clip into the Backrooms, and then, if they're fortunate enough, glitch back out of them. But the house on Ash Tree Lane does feature a stable and menacing as fuck doorway into its own liminal space. Though I'll admit, that's not unique to House of Leaves. The video game Control, for instance, and to mention it again, features, let's say, semi-stable doorways into its liminally twisted Federal Bureau of Control and other related dimensions. In The Southern Reach, Area X is accessed through a stable doorway of sorts. Well, okay, physically stable at any rate, more or less. Because it's not exactly what I'd call stable in other ways, and actually, well, coming back through it isn't always necessarily all that straightforward, so maybe disregard the physically stable bit, now that I think about it. But moving on, the movie also shows us characters, or, well, one of its main characters, Clark, develop a fascination with an obsessive desire to explore and keep exploring the Backrooms, in spite of his, once again, realistic, understandable, and appropriate fear of them. This obviously reminded me of Will Navidson's characterization in House of Leaves. Though once again, that element is not unique to it. The Southern Reach, to name it again, is absolutely chock-a-block full of people fascinated and obsessed with, but also terrified of Area X. There's the rather small, I'll admit, but fun little detail that the still lives, the people copies inside of the Backrooms, are all made of undefined white stuff, which Clark has discovered you can happily snack on, and this reminded me of the ubiquitous, colorless, and unidentifiable matter the liminal space in House of Leaves is made of. And if I wanted to stretch this a little further, it also kind of tangentially reminded me of the undifferentiated cellular mimicry in Annihilation. And I'll leave it at that. Side note though, no wonder I vibe with this movie so hard given what it reminded me of. Damn. And then finally, there's the fact the environment of the Backrooms has a dynamic relationship with the people that go into it. It most certainly affects, not to say fucks with, the psyches, but it is also very directly, in this case, affected by their psyches, more specifically, their memories, on an individual, and I think, because that was a little unclear to me, on a collective level. This world-building and thematic element, especially the people's psyches influencing the space part of the relationship, is absolutely present in House of Leaves and props up one of its core themes, in my subjective opinion, as always. Which brings me to the third big thing I loved about this movie, and which I will obviously dissect with more granularity because I'm an ideas-driven reader, watcher, and gamer. Might be slightly less applicable with that last one, but you get the gist, because you guessed it, it's the fact this movie is properly ideas-driven and commits to its theming. I love to see it all day, every day. I'd say there are two big themes, or thematic motifs, if you prefer, present in the Backrooms movie. The first, and I'd argue less prominent one, being that of the obsessive, then maddening and ultimately futile quest for meaning when faced with reality-breaking shit. So, the cosmic horror of it all. Cosmic horror itself not being a theme per se, of course, but as a specific subcategory or flavor of horror, I find it's generally a decently strong vehicle for theming, at least in the stories I've read and enjoyed, so make of that what you will. I'd argue the cosmic horror aspect of the Backrooms theming is less prominent, because it's rather passive and more just present because of the inherent reality-breaking wrongness of the liminal space of the Backrooms itself. It's more about the proverbial vibes than anything else, which is obviously also true of works like House of Leaves and its house on Ash Tree Lane, or The Southern Reach and its Area X, or some of Lovecraft's stuff in its cyclopean architecture. But I'd contend those works of fiction, the former two especially, also actively do something more with the horror, or at the very least unsettling weirdness inherent in their liminal spaces or elements, with the liminality itself, really. That's not to say this here largely vice-based motif wasn't enjoyable. It absolutely was. Again, I got the cosmic dread chills. Yay! And those were absolutely tied to a couple of the movie's characters' obsessive, if not maddening, need to make sense of the Backrooms, to grasp its true nature, its point or points of origin, its meaning, and perhaps purpose. And Clark, like I already said, very strongly reminded me of House of Leaves' Will Navidson, though there are also very clear differences in motivation between the two, and House of Leaves fleshes its characters out a lot more than the Backrooms does. I enjoyed all of that, but it also clearly wasn't the focus of the movie in terms of thematic exploration, and I'd say it was also ultimately a little hamstrung in terms of emotional effectiveness by its monster. Also a little hamstrung in terms of thematic effectiveness by the fact a partial explanation is actually given for what the Backrooms actually are. Then again, it's more of a hypothesis than anything else at the end of the day, so it really wasn't that big of a deal for me, but I'll come back to that. The monster, though, it's difficult, because on the one hand, I prefer my liminal spaces without monsters, or at the very least, obviously present monsters. I prefer the mindfuckery, if you will, of plausible deniability, and the possibility that there is something much more incomprehensibly worse happening. I also generally dislike humanoid monsters. Like, in terms of psychological horror, an uncanny humanoid is infinitely creepier, scarier than a creature to me, but in terms of sheer creativity and aesthetics, I guess, I want them eldritch. What the fuck am I even looking at, beasties? Like, if we're gonna go the monster route, give me elder things, know what I mean? On the other hand, though, the Backrooms monster and the form it takes make perfect logical sense in terms of the movie's other, more prominent and developed theme, and illustrates its commitment to it, so I can't be mad at it for that. So in this case, it really does boil down to personal preference in terms of creativity and aesthetics, like I said. And then, yeah, in terms of theming, because whilst I enjoyed the movie's other theme, which I'm about to get into, don't worry, and loved the way it weaved it out of the Backrooms as a concept, when it comes to weird fictional premises like this, I kind of prefer the cosmic horror side of things. Or at least a stronger utilization of it in terms of theming. So in the second half of the movie, Clark offers the audience a hypothesis regarding the nature of the Backrooms. He posits they are the spatial manifestation of continuously collecting and ever degrading human memories of the spaces they inhabit, and then, to a lesser extent, based on what the movie actually shows you at any rate, of the people they interact with, and of themselves. The monster in the Backrooms, the Minotaur in the Labyrinth, if you will, if you know, you know, is nothing but a warped copy of Clark wearing his marketing pirate costume. The uncanny valley still lives he encounters are warped copies of real people, one of them being the copy of his ex-wife, a detail I completely miss myself. And you see a warped copy of Marie at the end of the movie too, though I'm not entirely sure how to interpret that in terms of narrative implications, if I'm being perfectly honest. The limited variety of classical Backrooms environments I very mildly complained about earlier, well, that makes sense given the rooms we see in the movie result from the, let's go with eldritch copying, of the real, or at least non-liminal spaces directly adjacent to them. So Clark's furniture store and the neighborhood it resides in. As to the weird, nonsensical, non-Euclidean nature of its architecture and geometry, that essentially results from a possibly infinite accumulation of copying errors or progressive degradation of its infinite copies. You can kind of see it either way, because what matters at the end of the day here is that it's all about memory. And well, memory can both be imprecise and degrade over time. So yes, the other much more prominent and developed theme of the Backrooms movie is that of memory. If you want to get more specific with it though, as I generally do, and take into account the story's characters and their relationship with the psyche-sensitive space of the Backrooms, it's memory in relation to trauma. Trauma in the broad sense of things that have wounded us, not just, actual PTSD, and nostalgia, or just being stuck in the past as a response to that. Now, as I see it, there are two levels to this theme, one being the individual level, the other being the collective, quite simply. And I definitely think the nostalgia response, as I think of it, applies more strongly to the latter. Though I have to be honest here, in terms of world-building foundations, I'm not entirely sure if the Backrooms actually do iterate themselves from both individual and collective memories, and if so, to what extent they pull from each category. Because when Clark initially shares his hypothesis, I'm pretty sure it's implied the space primarily pulls its data, if you will, from the collective repertoire of human memories, but then the story seems to shift it the other way around, showing us all the ways more individual memories have and are shaping the space. Well, so maybe it is indeed 50-50, and if anything, the fact there remains ambiguity there, it is just one pretty disturbed dude's hypothesis after all, makes it more cosmic horror-y, which I like. So okay, footing on ahead with the assumption it is indeed 50-50, we have these two levels, the individual and the collective. I am, quite frankly, less interested in the collective aspect of this theme, especially as it pertains to nostalgia, because full disclosure, I don't really experience nostalgia. Not broadly for my childhood or teenage years in terms of entirely personal experience, nor really for the cultural hallmarks that define the decades said life stages took place in. Sure, I'm as likely to go, hey, do you remember video cassettes? Hey, do you remember when we accessed the internet through phone lines and the unforgettable little tune it made? Or I don't know, do you remember when we switched to the euro? I barely do, actually. I was like 8 years old, but whatever. I'm as likely to do that as any other person my age. For the mimi crack of it, I guess. And sure, I'm hype as fuck for the new Spyro and Okami games coming down the line. And those are things I initially loved as a child, then teenager. But I don't get, so to speak, teary-eyed over those things, those kinds of things, because I love them initially as a kid. I get hyped and teary-eyed over them because I love them and they hold meaning for me, as do a lot of things I first met and consumed as an adult. I'm not saying I'm completely 1000% immune to nostalgia either. It's a human emotion. Obviously, I have felt it, and it definitely factored a little when I picked up and played Hogwarts Legacy as an example, but it truly is a rare and minor emotional experience for me. Still, as Super Eyepatch Wolf points out in his video, the feeling of nostalgia is very often a core feature of liminal space imagery, and thus of the Backrooms as well, and I'm well aware there is currently an undeniable trend in nostalgic media that is increasingly catering to my very own millennial generation. We're just kind of hitting that age as a group, I guess. The oldest millennials are reaching their midlife years at this point. A lot of them are settled into nuclear families, in lesser numbers than previous generations, but still, with all the pressures that come with that. And a lot of those same millennials, you guessed it, create the media we currently consume. Also, the world's on fire? So it makes sense that there is an uptick in stories that hark back to a simpler time of child and or teenagehood innocence, whimsy, freedom, etc., assuming once again that was ever actually applicable to your own experience. Which brings me to the fact there's also an undeniable trend and uptick in nostalgia horror, especially when it comes to video games. Stories that subvert the presumed remembered comfort of past life stages, that shatter the rose-tinted glasses through which we look at the past, be it our own personal one, or that of our age cohort, our social class, our culture, etc. The Backrooms, a movie, like I said, set in 1990 for now obvious reasons, definitely falls within that trend to some extent, in that it works, amongst other things of course, as an anti-nostalgia story. But once again, I mostly felt this on a more individual and what I'm going to call trauma-centered level. So I'm going to recommend you all go watch my friend Shane Cadden's video about the Backrooms for further commentary on the more collective societal facet of nostalgia the movie is in thematic conversation with. And if you're a fan of horror cinema, horror media really, I'd also recommend you check out his other video essays as well while we're at it, because they are well worth watching. On a more individual level then, it is very obvious the different ways the movie's main characters, Clark and Marie, react to and interact with the Backrooms and its denizens parallel and embody the different ways they deal, or don't, with their own psychic wounds. Further than that, the Backrooms also catalyze each character's psychological climax? Or catharsis? Maybe epiphany? I'm not entirely sure what the exact right word for this is, during what is probably my second favorite part of the movie, set in its second half. The fucked up hostage dinner table scene is what I'm going to call it. We come to learn Clark's really just an asshole. A wounded one, to be sure, but an asshole nonetheless, eaten up by resentment, anger, an inability to own his shit, take responsibility, put in the work to heal and move on with his life. This is reflected in his obsessive need to keep exploring the backrooms and eventual decision to remain in them, as a permanent escape from his actual life and responsibilities, from a world where actions have consequences, and it's also reflected by the very fact the backrooms is a space seemingly made up of infinitely successive and ever-degrading layers of frozen memory, a frozen past. It fits his frozen, recursive, and then degrading mindset perfectly. Degrading because he's going a little batty in there, to put it lightly. The monster, for its part, acts both as an uncanny emanation of the backrooms and an incarnation of Clark's festering emotional wounds and state of mind, which she comes to embrace, although it, the monster, then, well, eats him. He eats them real good, which I guess you can read as an illustration of the fact you can't just cheat your way out of healing work. Unaddressed shit will always come back to bite you in the ass because it is ultimately destructive. Which, you know what? I completely agree with. But then again, it is also a horror movie at the end of the day, and we probably need a measure of spookums for spookums' sake, so as always, you be the judge of that. Then there's Marie. It's established early on that Marie had a pretty traumatic childhood as the child of a severely mentally ill single mother, and that this trauma is still relatively active within her. So active, in fact, that during the dinner table scene, we learn that this is basically the reason she became a psychiatrist. Or at least one of the major reasons, because I guess she doesn't technically spell it out as such, but come on, it is very heavily implied. It's a massive oversimplification of part psychology and IFS, but the gist of it is that Marie carries a wounded part that feels a need to fix others because her child self thought she needed to fix her mother to feel safe, to feel loved, etc. But as someone who has experienced the ravaging effects of untreated, unaddressed mental illness, of damaged psyches firsthand, and trained as a psychiatrist, not that that actually guarantees anything in real life, mind you, but let's not go there. And I guess as a function of the kind of person she is, quite simply, Marie understands the importance of accountability in healing work and the dangers of psychological stagnation, which then allows her to let go of her trauma. This mindset and journey are reflected, I'd say, a tad less directly, a tad less one-to-one, but still, in her fundamental rejection of the backrooms, and in her confrontation with Clark's monstrous copy, which she eventually kills, using a cemented handprint she recovered from the demolition site of her childhood home at the beginning of the movie, and which she then leaves behind in the backrooms. Subtle. Now, whilst I'll ultimately allow it for narrative and thematic expediency, I do think Marie's liberation from trauma was a little too easy. Dealing with trauma and its consequences in real life is generally a bit more complicated than that. Though hey, for all I know, surviving an encounter with a liminal space monster is the miracle cure for PTSD we've all been hoping for. And whilst I found her character arc pretty positive overall and personally satisfying, it does contain a significant, if ambiguous, caveat, given she gets picked up by ASIC at the end of the movie, and then we don't really know what happens to her. So, a bit of a bitter note there, I suppose. There was also something truly glorious and deeply cathartic for me about the way she let her rip in Clark's face and essentially told him to cry her a river and go fuck himself at that cursed dinner table. Because it illustrates, gives expression to some of the things I've observed and experienced in terms of gendered psychology when it comes to healing work, emotional management, or even nostalgia, actually. So, yes, I kind of lied there. I'm less interested in theming that deals with the collective societal aspects of memory, trauma, and nostalgia, except when it comes to sex, class, and gender, which honestly shouldn't surprise anyone who's been here for a while. Because see, I've always been of the opinion that men, on average, experience nostalgia, especially nostalgia for childhood and one's teenage years, more than women. But then it stands to reason men, especially older and straight and white, you know the drill, men also probably feel a lot more nostalgic towards past eras and societal setups, shall we say, than women and other oppressed and marginalized groups. Again, on average, when it comes to the more personal life history side of things, my case rests entirely on the reality of gendered socialization and the fact girls are, once again, on average, encouraged to be quiet, contained, composed, in control of their emotions, responsible, ever mindful of other needs too, a lot of the time before their own. In a word, mature, unchildlike, a lot younger than boys. And if as a girl you also have siblings and are anything other than the youngest child, odds are you'll also be encouraged to act as a secondary parent, to lesser or greater extents. We're also, sexualized to hell the second breast buds show up on our chest when we're as young as 10 or even 9 years old, and it never really lets up after that. And then when we finally do reach adulthood, we're infantilized to hell, not taken seriously by doctors, and encouraged to look like barely pubescent girls because you can't fucking win with this shite. So, on some level, outside of any other potential trauma making things even more unrose-colored, what the fuck is there even to long for in one's girlhood as a woman? Yes, okay, I'm exaggerating a tiny bit, and once again, I'm speaking in averages because obviously plenty of women can and do experience girlhood nostalgia. Nostalgia is a human emotion, but I genuinely believe it's more of a male thing because men, on average, have more reasons to long for those days, quite simply. On an anecdotal level, I've certainly known and conversed with more nostalgic men than women, whether my parents' age or my own. Now, in terms of actual data, well, I'll admit I've only done cursory research into this topic, chiefly for this video, and so B, it seems the results are mostly mixed. I've seen papers that conclude the experience of nostalgia is indeed greater in men, but then also others that seem to conclude it's more the opposite, but that the trend is then reversed as you go up in age, so we need more research, clearly, and as always, make of that what you will. But then beyond that, I think there's also a gender-informed difference between the ways men and women, on average, deal with mental illness, mental distress, trauma, between the ways men and women, on average, just deal with their emotions in general. Surely that, at the very least, is not a controversial take. And in any case, that's not just my opinion, my take. There is data to back this up, and it is, for instance, a fact men, on average, once again, respond unhealthily to mental distress in much more externally destructive ways, whereas women do so in much more internally self-destructive ways. I want to be clear that I am talking about unhealthy responses, unhealthy coping mechanisms. I'm not automatically condemning mentally ill men just for being mentally ill here. That being said, I can be critical and compassionate at the same time, because on a personal level, let me tell you, I've certainly experienced this difference firsthand, and it was not pleasant. A majority of the men I've been close to have, to varying extents, made me, or others close to them, feel responsible for their pain, their issues, their shit, and have, at times, to varying extents, metaphorically punched me in the face with it. That, or they simply wallowed in it, instead of taking ownership of their healing. Now, yes, it's true, some of those men were abusive as well. They were abusers on top of everything else. But not all. This stuff I've been talking about can also very much apply to non-abusive men. In a way, trust me, bro, on that one. And it's not like it makes those men evil either, right? Obviously not, but those behavioral patterns are not good and they should be addressed and corrected. And of course, it can apply to women as well. And then conversely, I also know men who aren't like that at all, or barely. But once again, we're talking about broad patterns, about averages here. And so yes, I felt all of that in that cursed dinner table scene. Don't get me wrong, it's not like there's actual proper theming on gender in the Backrooms, but that scene just resonated with me as a traumatized person and as a traumatized woman. You can't imagine how incredibly refreshing it felt for me to have a female character metaphorically say, enough is enough. I am done with this shite. You as a person, so Clark, you as a person, as a man, are in fact somewhat responsible for your healing. It's not my fault. It's just the way my brain works. Well, guess what? You are your goddamn brain, dipshit. I know I don't have it exactly right there. But holy shit, what an iconic line. 10 out of 10 no notes for that one. Before I continue with my next and final major point, I want to take a quick moment to acknowledge the elephant? Honestly, I don't think it even really rises to the level of an elephant, but okay, in the room of generative AI, and more specifically than that, generative AI imagery and so-called AI art. I don't personally call it art, but okay. Because yes, it's not that hard to see similarities between the uncanny, glitchy quality of the Backrooms objects and still lives, and the uncanny and still often glitchy quality of AI-generated images, especially when it comes to finer details like printed text, logos, or thingies. As such, one could further argue there are parallels between the sterile quality of a dimension made up of frozen memories and the sterility inherent in art that results for something that doesn't and cannot benefit from the fluid, dynamic, adaptable, and continuously experiencing creativity of living organic beings like ourselves. And I'd argue, to a lesser extent perhaps, but still other animals. All genuine organic creativity draws from memory, of course. Nothing is ever truly original, yada yada yada, we know the drill. But it also involves transformative processes, innovation, the individual artist or creator's unique spark. In short, human art is alive in a way AI art can't be. It is stuck in a state of non-life in a way you can consider similar to the Backrooms. That being said, I don't think this idea ever coalesces into an actual theme. I certainly didn't feel it or even really see it in the story, or the world building myself, in large part because I don't think you can actually fully draw a one-to-one comparison between the Backrooms, a really bloody weird liminal space that does still technically experience change and reacts dynamically to the people it interacts with, and generative AI. Or I mean generative AI imagery. But it's not like there's nothing there either, and I would never say people who read it that way are wrong. So yeah, I thought it was worth acknowledging for completeness' sake, if nothing else. So whilst it's undeniably true, I prefer the cosmic horror angle, weirdness, spookies, mindfuckery, and potential theming when it comes to liminal spaces and liminal space horror. I'm impressed with the way the Backrooms executed its theming on memory, trauma, and nostalgia. More specifically than that, I'm impressed with how well the Backrooms was able to very directly weave this theme out of the very world-building premise of the Backrooms. Now, again, was it the most subtle thing in the world? No, but by and large, it worked. and I respect that. Ultimately, though, this isn't something entirely unique to the Backrooms, right? The Backrooms certainly does put its unique spin on it, and I thoroughly enjoyed that, but the pairing of theming on memory and trauma, the idea of delving into the twists and turns of one's psyche as one explores a seemingly infinite liminal space, has been done in other works of fiction. The obvious one, yes, being A House of Leaves, but hold that thought for a minute, because first, I'd like to mention another work of fiction I haven't thought of all that much since I read it. In no small part because I didn't really like it, but which came back into my immediate awareness when I saw it briefly mentioned in relation to the Backrooms movie in some Reddit thread or another. And that is Piranesi, written by Susanna Clarke. I wanted to bring it up because what's noteworthy about that novel is that it's not horror at all, or only marginally so, and not in the traditional horror genre sense. If you read it, you'll hopefully understand what I mean here. But it does technically feature a seemingly infinite liminal space, which, okay, I'm gonna be nice here and issue a last-minute world-building spoiler alert, so skip ahead if you really don't want to know anything about it in 3, 2, 1. Which you come to understand through the narrative is a spatial manifestation of humanity's collective knowledge, and so by extension, humanity's collective memory as a cultural and technological species. This manifestation is, it must be said, rather abstract. The liminal space in Piranesi isn't some infinite library or anything like that, but a liminal space manifesting human memory, human knowledge, is what it essentially is. Now, I must add the caveat that I'm pretty sure Piranesi also draws its world-building premise very specifically from the concept of memory palaces, which is a memorization technique developed by the ancient Romans, I think, though for all I know there are equivalents to this in other cultures, and which was also used by scholars in the Middle Ages and, well, I guess the early modern period. So it's a real thing. It's a real thing. You can look it up and read more about it if you're interested. I thought it was very freaking cool the first time I encountered the concept, way before I ever read Piranesi, and I kind of wish I'd learned to use a memory pass as a child, honestly, because I don't know about you, but I wouldn't mind having to rely less on external technology to remember important and or valuable bits of information and experience. I have a pretty good memory as is, in all fairness. A bit too good of a memory for some things, unfortunately, but discussion for another day and all that. So obviously, Piranesi's liminal space isn't liminal in quite the same ways or for quite the same genre and tonal reasons, I'm gonna go with that, as those of House of Leaves or the Backrooms. It's not cosmic horror in the slightest, but because of the way it engages with the idea of spatially manifested memory and mind, if here on a purely collective level, I thought it was relevant enough to mention in relation to those other works of cosmic liminal horror. Also, if you want to get funny with it for a minute, you could play a little game of reversal and argue the Backrooms are also actually a giant memory palace in the process of breaking down ad infinitum, and that the house on Ash Tree Lane isn't, like I jokingly posited in my review of House of Leaves, Cthulhu's Lego house, but Cthulhu's memory palace. On a more serious note, and finally, coming back to House of Leaves, well, yes, like I said much earlier in this video, House of Leaves also features theming on memory, and more specifically trauma in relation to biographical memory, and most definitely uses its liminal labyrinth to explore that. At the very least, it certainly interacts with the human beings that explore it in a way that deeply affects their psyches, and is then itself to a certain extent affected by their psyches in turn. That was my reading of it at any rate. Speaking of labyrinths, if there's one quality the liminal spaces of the Backrooms, House of Leaves, and Piranesi share, it's that they're all labyrinthine. And the interesting thing about that is that if you want to take it a step further and look at it on a more macro, quasi-archetypal level, the simple fact is labyrinths, as spatial constructs, work pretty damn well as metaphors for the human psyche. I mean, the human mind is very often directly represented as a labyrinth in visual stories and media, and thus also work pretty damn well as world-building foundations for theming that delves into the processes of the human psyche. Heck, I'm pretty sure Carl Gustav Jung, to bring him into the conversation, had a whole shtick about labyrinths specifically, though I could be wrong. Also, I don't actually much care because fuck psychoanalysis, sorry not sorry, I have my reasons, let's move on. And so I know I've stated a few times now that when it comes to liminal spaces and their potential in terms of world building and especially theming, I prefer the more directly cosmic horror side of things. I stand by that. But I'd like to add that this is by no means incompatible with theming more pointedly dedicated to, shall we say, more grounded, human-centered things such as memory, trauma, and nostalgia. You can absolutely weave the two together and explore the maddening ends people can go to make sense not of bended or broken reality, not of an unknowable cosmos, but of their own lives and of the pain they experience or were subjected to in their lives. Because the maddening quest for ultimately ungraspable or unprocessable meaning can take many forms. I don't really think the Backrooms movie does this at all. It's not like its themes are entirely separate, unrelating, but I'd argue they're overall pretty distinct, and pride of place is ultimately given to the memory, trauma, and nostalgia stuff. No, the work of fiction that actually properly blends the two and explores the cosmic horror of human psychology, if you will, is, well, of course, yes, it is House of Leaves. It absolutely features the cosmic horror trope of the maddening and ultimately futile quest for meaning in a more general Lovecraftian sense, but also more specifically as it pertains to the need to make sense of one's painful life experiences when that may simply not be possible, because there may not be any deeper meaning to be found in one's painful past. Sometimes bad shit just happens, and you have to accept that, because there may not be a singular clean meaning to be found in one's past. Sometimes shit's complicated, and you need time and mental fortitude to process that, because you may simply not be able to grasp or process the meaning that is there for whatever reason. There is a lot of potential for horror-focused theming there. The House of Leaves absolutely makes use of. And it's a very human kind of horror. Which brings me to my final point, and what will perhaps be my spiciest take of the day. I don't know, you tell me. I think liminal space horror, given its more human-centric thematic potential, can, depending on the story and what it does with the concept, be seen as a cozier sub-branch of cosmic horror. Okay, maybe not actually cozy. Cozy's not quite the right word, because I mean, you're not going to chill Stardew Valley style in the Backrooms or the house on Ash Tree Lane. The gods have mercy on your soul if you decide to do that, though. So let's go instead with intimate, familiar, or even domestic cosmic horror, because its human-centeredness definitely makes it a bit different than OG Lovecraftian cosmic horror, or even the cosmic horror of the Southern Reach. Don't get me wrong, Jeff Vandermeer's series certainly deals with human-centric themes, but it's, well, also an undeniably environmentalist story concerned with the web of life as a whole, its dignity, its right to share the planet with us, and not just our selfish human interests. And it features a quest to make sense of something fundamentally alien and unknowable in the more traditional Lovecraftian sense. And so with OG Lovecraftian horror, sure, there's a very thick running thread of theming on alienation in its stuff, which says a lot about human beings and the ways we perceive and interact with one another. But Lovecraftian fiction is also obviously very strongly about big cosmic monsters, with or without tentacles, that illustrate the fact we humans know jack shit about the universe, can't ever really know shit about the universe, that we are puny and insignificant in the wider scheme of the universe, and then our brains explode from the revelations. In terms of theming, that's a very macro, non-anthropocentric view of things. But this isn't necessarily or as straightforwardly true of liminal space horror, especially if we're talking about liminal spaces made out of human-built environments such as family homes, hotel hallways, diners, swimming pools, indoor playgrounds, warehouses, etc. In terms of world building, we're de facto in much more anthropocentric territory, and then in terms of theming, I think this just kind of naturally lends itself to much more human-centric theming on, say, the processes of the human psyche, like memory, the way we deal with trauma, and things like that. So that's my take. Liminal space horror is, or can be, a more intimate, or familiar, or pseudo-cozy subcategory of cosmic horror. So to close the circle, I thoroughly enjoyed the Backrooms movie, if for no other reason than it greatly increased my appreciation for other works of weird, liminal, and/or cosmic horror fiction through comparative analysis and review. I partly jest, of course. I also enjoyed the Backrooms movie on its very own merit, for several different reasons, the chief of which being that it properly engaged in theming and committed to its ideas. Once again, I always love to see it. That being said, and to reiterate my two major points of criticism, the movie doesn't have the most subtle thematic execution in the world, and at times it kind of skirted the line of being a little too on the nose with its commentary. But I'll allow it because it felt earnest, and mostly worked in terms of logical consistency and emotional impact. And it could have explored its themes with more depth and granularity through stronger character work and further world building. In fact, given the depth with which you can explore the themes it chose, it almost felt at times like it had taken on just a smidge more than it could actually comfortably handle in terms of execution, especially given its relatively short runtime. Then again, I like the fact it's not that long of a movie, that it doesn't overstay its welcome, so take it with a pinch of salt, I suppose. So if I were to rate the Backrooms, I think I'd give it a soft 7.5 out of 10. Friendly reminder that in my rating system, a 7.5 out of 10 means it's a soft 7.5 out of 10, so it was really good. Perhaps even very good, like properly very good. It's that kind of territory. And honestly, these days, trust me, I don't give out 7.5 out of 10s, or even 7 out of 10s to books, TV shows, or movies all that often. In all honesty though, it's also probably true I'm rating this movie the way I am because I've read even better stories that play with all of these ideas. So, recommendation time! Go read House of Leaves. Okay, no, slowing down. It's a conditional recommendation because I fully agree that House of Leaves is absolutely the kind of book a lot of people will very understandably bounce off of really fucking hard. Although, I don't think it's actually that hard to read either, to be clear. But still, it is a gothic fiction. It requires a certain level of open-mindedness, patience, and commitment. But if you're up for that, you should definitely try it. And also, before I forget, whilst it's true it shares themes with the Backrooms, it also does other shit on top of that. And in fact, the number one reason why I think it's so bloody brilliant is because, as far as I'm concerned, it spins cosmic horror out of the concept of death of the author. And I stand by that 1,000,000,000%. And then I need to recommend The Southern Reach again. Look, I have to. It's my favorite science fiction series of all time, and whilst it's not technically liminal space horror, like House of Leaves or The Backrooms, I'd argue it's still tangentially related in that it is weird fiction with quite a bit of horror, cosmic horror included, in that it technically features a liminal environment, here a transitional ecosystem, in that it's hella tonally atmospheric, and in that it is deliciously, oh so deliciously ideas-driven. But it also has good character work. So please, if you love any or all of the above, and I guess in this specific case also really care about the environment, go read The Southern Reach right the fuck now! And that's all I've got to say about that. That will be all for this review and comparative analysis of the Backrooms movie. I hope you found this video interesting, engaging, entertaining, or even just a chill way to pass some of your time. If you'd like to share your thoughts, feelings, opinions, what have you about the movie, or any of the other works of fiction I mentioned in the video, please feel free to do so in the comments down below. And on that very final note, I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Please do take good care of yourselves. Thank you for watching, and I shall see you all, I don't really know when, but at some point in the next video. And until then, bye-bye!